everybody. Checking on Facebook and Instagram. Excellent. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt. I am currently lead faculty for both the clinical management of the fitness athlete, pregnancy and postpartum, and our modern management of the curriculum. When I am not teaching continuing education, I am also a part-time PhD student who is in year 5 and am currently writing my dissertation for my PhD, which is looking at the use of high-intensity resistance training to prevent transitions in mobility status for older adults. Today, I wanted to hop on here and talk about some things that I've been seeing pretty consistently across the social media landscape that I think is really, really important to talk about in regard to being an evidence-informed clinician. I put up a question box on my personal Instagram page a couple of weeks ago when I was thinking about this episode and was asking you what you think are some of the most challenging things about keeping up to date with the literature and understanding what the literature is telling us and what information we can really extrapolate from a study when we read it. So I think where I want us to start today is talking about how we are an evidence-informed profession. When we talk about evidence-informed practice, it's like this Venn diagram that has 3 overlapping parts. We have evidence-based practice, which means that we are letting the growing literature base support and guide our clinical decisions. We have our own clinical experience where we have certain modalities and different types of techniques that we use that may not be the best to perform a study with, or research hasn't been done in that area quite yet, but you've seen some effectiveness anecdotally. And the third is obviously one of the most important, and it's the wants and wishes of your client. And an example that we talk about in the MMOA course is what happens when you have a client who wants ultrasound on their erectors and you know that they're getting really close to 1 rep max living. Do you just say, no, that's not evidence informed and get them lifting weights? Or do you respect some of their decisions and use that time where you're doing ultrasound at the very beginning, starting to taper it off and using that as an educational time to be talking through different things around health promotion and the reason why we need to lift weights to continue to be resilient? And sometimes it can be really hard from the evidence-based practice perspective to continue to stay on top of the research. Honestly, the field of rehabilitation science literature has really exploded over the last several decades, and it can be quite challenging the further away we are from our clinical schooling to be able to stay on top of it. You get busy with work and you can have family obligations, and a parent can get sick, and you can have a full caseload and burnout and all these types of things that it can be really, really tough to become and stay on top of the evidence. And so the first thing that I wanted to talk about today is how can we try to become evidence-informed clinicians when our time is extremely limited. And number one is obviously where my bias lies around continuing education. I pride myself as a continuing education instructor, and I know that every faculty at ICE prides themselves in the fact that we stay current in the literature in our topic area. And so I'm doing a PhD, so I'm obviously in the weeds of the literature, but I can speak the same for every faculty and every TA across our company, that we all stay up to date with the literature. And so if you take an ICE course, you can be confident that we know what the new literature is, and we have done a very systematic scan of what the literature is saying in order for us to be able to present to you a continuing education course that allows you to practice at the top of your license. Number 2 is we have emails that try and help guide you to some of the new research that is coming out. Our Hump Day Hustling comes out every Wednesday, so it's going to be up tomorrow. And all the faculty, when they see really new, interesting research that sometimes goes against what we're thinking, comes out, we think it's really important to give you breadth and depth of the literature in small snippets and chunks. And so that's what the Hump Day Hustling email was about and why it's there. And so if you don't have a ton of time, sign up for that email, and it allows you to give a bite-sized look at something that's happening once a week that won't take you more than 10 or around the geriatric clinician. So we're talking more about, we're trying to cover the gamut of geriatric care, so community dwelling older adults to institutionalized older adults, and kind of covering a lot of those topics there. The other thing that you can do to try and stay on top of the literature is there are some subscription services that do a lot of the research synthesis for you. One example is Physio Network. They are a monthly subscription where they have experts in different areas of practice, and every month they provide you with a summary of a research article, and they go through clinical relevance, statistical significance, methods, pros, cons. And it's a really nice, I think it's like 20 or 25 pages summary. And as a clinic owner, I oftentimes would subscribe to that and have our group, our clinic group, talk about some of the research articles and say, is this going with our bias, against our bias? Is there something that we can do better if we see a client that is presenting with X, Y, Z? So those are some ways to help get the summary. From a social media perspective, I think it is just so important for you to be vetting who you are digesting research from online. Everybody is going to have a little bit of a different bias, but you want to make sure that if you are using social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, which I think is wonderful, to stay on top of the literature because you're following certain accounts, which is great. I think it's important that you know that they are doing that work as well, and that they are not just reading the abstract. And because it's so important that we are making the appropriate conclusions and we are not overstating what a research article is trying to tell us. And so that kind of goes into my next point around the levels of evidence. And I'm sure everyone has seen this in their schooling, but it's good to remember that we have this hierarchy of evidence when it comes to the strength of the recommendation that we can make. And so at the bottom, we're looking at anecdotal narrative reviews. Then going up a level, we're looking at case reports and retrospective studies. We go up a level and we're looking at prospective studies. So if we're looking back in time, we can't control as many variables as if we're looking forward in time. So a retrospective study from a level of evidence perspective is never going to be as strong as looking forward and being able to control certain confounding variables that can really influence the data. So we have prospective cohort studies. Then we go up a level to randomized control trials where we're taking as many of those biases out as possible. But there are certain criteria for RCTs that we need to make sure that we are aware of. And then we have the synthesis of the literature that is done systematically, which is very important, systematically, which is our systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and even more importantly, our Cochrane reviews. And so when we're thinking about how much we are putting into some of the recommendations, sometimes we have to go with the highest level of evidence we have, and sometimes that isn't a high level. For example, a lot of our female athlete literature, because it is so new, where women are starting to challenge the paradigm of the capacity to be athletes during their transition through motherhood, we have a lot of cross-sectional data or retrospective interviews with moms about what happened to them during their pregnancy journey and their postpartum journey. And that's where we have to start, right? Like, we have to start by conceptualizing this is a gap in the literature. Oftentimes that is done through surveys or focus groups or Delphi roundtables, et cetera. Then we identify where those gaps are, and it allows us to do more prospective studies by recruiting athletes to be involved in things like randomized control trials or prospective cohort studies where you're getting women who find out that they're pregnant in the first trimester and follow their journey forward in order for us to have a stronger base in the literature to be able to make clinical conclusions. So it is really important. And it's why oftentimes when I'm doing a literature search, if I don't have a ton of time, I'm looking for the systematic review, meta-analyses first, scanning through the articles that they included. So reading the systematic review, scanning through the articles that they included, and picking up some of their key studies that have the highest weight on forest plot, and allowing me to look more in depth at their method sections in order for me to get an idea of how these research articles were performed. That leads me to my next point, and I'm going to try and not make this long because I can try and really rant about this stuff because it's my world right now, writing a dissertation. It is so important that you read the whole article. And I understand that that can be extremely challenging when you don't have access and you're only looking at the abstract because you don't have access to full text. Sometimes you can ask colleagues who are in institutionalized setting. You're in a university institution or a college institution who may have access to that article so that they can share it with you. And there are many, many journals now that are doing a component of or the entirety of their journal as open access. When they do open access, they put the cost of publishing on the researcher, but it allows everybody to access that article so that you can get the full text. We can't make conclusions based on abstract. The abstract is 200 words, 250 words, summarizing a 3,000 to 5,000 word manuscript that has a lot of nuance in it that is very, very important to whether or not we can implement some of these training modalities into our clinical practice. And what we need to be able to do as clinicians is recognize if a paper was well done, if a paper is clinically relevant, and if the statistical methods were done strongly enough that we can be confident that a true, really meaningful, clinically meaningful difference was seen with this modality. And so when we think about that and digest that, so the important part is that we have to look at the whole article. I did a pregnancy PPP on ice about a study that came out of a lab in Europe around heavy lifting with prolapse. And it was showing that you're at significantly higher risk. But when I started diving into the study, I saw that it was statistically significant on univariate analysis, but that when you started putting in known risk factors, including parity and obstetrical history, now those results were no longer statistically significant. So in my mind, that did not hold weight. But the conclusion that they were making is that maybe women shouldn't be lifting weights, and that is completely inappropriate. That is not a conclusion that could be made based on the statistical analysis that they did. And so reading through the whole article, I'm going to zero in today on some of the things that we need to be aware of from a statistics perspective. Number one is if you are seeing an RCT, it's very important in the methods section that the randomized control trial controls for missing data. What can often happen is you can have a randomized control trial and you can't control people's behavior. So people are going to drop out of the study for whatever reason. But it can be missing data that happened at random. They just didn't like it, didn't want to have the responsibility of being in the trial. Something came up in their family, et cetera. That would be kind of things that are outside of the intervention that cause them to drop out of the study. But that dropout could also be related to the study intervention, and they didn't tell the researchers. They could have dropped out and said, oh, well, my husband needs me more at home. But what really was happening is that she was getting an increase in musculoskeletal pain because of the exercise intervention, and she just didn't tell researchers. So we could have had people who had really negative results from the trial drop out, and we don't know. And we try to give justification or reasons. But again, those are often self-report. So the way that we control for missing data is by imputing that data. So when research studies take only the people who completed the trial and compare them statistically, we have a risk of bias that has been implemented in the study that can be concerning. So that's called completed cases carried forward. So what they're only doing is they're only taking the data that they have and analyzing that. And that, again, is increasing risk. So we have to try and make sure that we're holding studies accountable and saying, I recognize that people dropped out. That's absolutely fine. But you have to account for that data. And oftentimes what research trials will try to do is get individuals to come back for the post-assessment so you have another data point. But sometimes people don't want to do that because they leave the trial for a reason. And so you have to try and account for that data. And there's two main methods that people use, and that's mixed methods modeling as well as multiple imputation. And we don't have to go into the ins and outs of what those are. They just have to be present. They have to show that they accounted for that dropout data. And if you have an intervention study that has dropouts of more than 25 to 30%, especially if it's a shorter intervention, then that is going to make me have some flags go up in my head being like, why was there so many people that dropped out of this study? And is there something going on with the intervention that causes that to happen? The second thing that we're going to be talking about too is from a statistics perspective, is statistically significant versus clinically relevant. And this is really, really important in clinical research. And oftentimes we're looking more at the syntheses of research rather than the individual studies when it comes to this type of thing. But what we're thinking about with this is that if you have a study that shows a statistical significance on a 6-minute walk test, for example, but it's showing a significant difference of 5 meters, what we know is that depending on the patient population, the clinically relevant change for aerobic capacity and increases in physical function based on pre-established literature is between 20 and 55 meters. So there may be a statistical significant improvement of 5 meters, but that isn't clinically relevant to our client. And so we need to make sure that in the discussion section of these papers, especially in rehabilitation, where we're trying to influence practice of the practitioner, that we are talking about clinically relevant thresholds. And they're trying to give some sort of justification as to why potentially these interventions didn't reach that clinical significant threshold, and acknowledge some of those limitations that may have led to that. So that's another thing that's super important. The third one I'm going to talk about is when we're looking at prognosis and risk factors. Oftentimes when we're looking at trying to establish causative nature for different conditions, so this one with prolapse is an example, where we're trying to look at what factors influence whether or not a woman has an anatomical or a symptomatic feeling of prolapse. We are going to take a bunch of factors and we're going to put them into a linear or logistic regression. Linear regression for continuous variables, logistic regression for binary variables or categorical variables, and we're going to put them into a statistical algorithm. First, we're going to do it univariate, and you have to do this first because you have to show that prolapse versus vaginal delivery, is there a link between them? And is that link significant? Yes. Okay, so you take these variables, put them into your model, and then you put them into a multivariate model. And this is where it becomes very important. So we have these univariate models. We're like, these may be important for our study or for our question that we are having. And we're going to now ask the next question of, when we put into the equation what we already know is very important for whatever our question is. So let's go back to prolapse, like age, parity, and instrumented delivery. When we put those known risk factors into our model, does this extra variable give us more of a prediction of an incidence of prolapse? And if the answer is yes, it will be statistically significant even when put into multivariate analysis. When it is not, it will no longer be statistically significant, which means that we still know that those other known risk factors are bigger predictors of outcome than those ones that were statistically significant on univariate analysis. And that becomes very, very important in systematic reviews that are looking at prognostic risk factors and the way that we're making decisions on risk and how we're communicating risk to our client. And if we take some of the conclusions that say on univariate analysis, this was significant, and ignore the fact that it says on multivariate analysis, it wasn't, we get into trouble, because now we're overemphasizing data that we do not have justification to be emphasizing. The last thing I'm going to be talking about, and Al's going to kill me because I'm already at 20 minutes, but I'm going to stop ranting about this, is the next thing that we want to talk about is this study consistent with the literature or completely going against it? And not to say that going against the known literature is bad, but that is when we rely on systematic reviews, right? We want to take, if we have this one study that's going completely against the norm, it's going to attract attention. It might be the one piece of information that people hold on to, and it may lead to a misinformation highway that completely ignores the fact that we have 20 other studies that are showing that this is not true. And this is where it can be really dangerous when presented in social media as this new study that says, see, I always told you that this was wrong. And an example is with the COVID vaccine literature and pregnancy and postpartum. There was a study that showed that there were some disruptions in menstrual cycling with the COVID-19 vaccine. And this was temporary, and it was less than 30 days, and it was in a certain window. I'm not super up to date with that. I haven't read that research paper in a couple of weeks, but there were certain parameters, but it was temporary. It was not affecting fertility. And there's no evidence to support that there's any issues with infertility with any of the COVID vaccines that are currently being circulated across our world. But that literature, that one study, was taken out of context. It was sensationalized across social media, and it was fueling that justification that, see, if you don't have a period because you took the COVID vaccine, well, you can't get pregnant. So obviously it is leading to infertility, and that is not true. And we do not have the literature to support that. And so we have to make sure that when we are reporting on studies that are inconsistent with the literature, that we are not overstating the claim. Say, this is interesting. This is only one study that looked at this. An example, I posted about a systematic review that showed that 2 studies were going against the recommendation that going into saunas or hot tubs when you're pregnant is going to cause hyperthermia that could lead to fetal complications. But again, I stated we only have 2 studies. We need to be looking at this more, but our initial literature is suggesting that potentially we do not have to be so fearful about being in a hot tub for 10 minutes. So different things like that are really, really important considerations. If you have any questions about the analysis of the literature, ways that we can control for, different variables, how to stay on top of the literature, please reach out to me. I think this is such an important topic, and I know it's probably not the sexiest topic, but it's so clinically relevant, and it can hugely impact your practice. And we need to make sure that when we are making recommendations to our clients, it's because we know that there is the strength in the literature to support those recommendations. We want to keep our clients safe. We want to make sure that we're doing everything at the top of our license, and this is one way for you to do that. All right, I'm going to get off here before Alan kills me that this is too long. But if you guys have any other questions, please let me know. I hope you have a wonderful Tuesday. If you haven't signed up for our Hump Day Hustling or our MMOA Digest emails, you can go into the resource section of our website and sign up for those. Otherwise, I will see you all in the PPP on Ice next time. Bye.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.